to move from ambition to technical detail very, very quickly. That's the same reaction that we had on the 7th of October when the border operating model was announced by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. We still need that technical detail. We need better access for business to Her Majesty's government and the NI executive, which we still don't have. We got to realise that this isn't just about GB to NI or NI to GB. This is about a whole island economy that is important as well. It's the whole island's economy. For example, a bottle of Bailey's will have 5 border movements north-south before it's a bottle of Bailey's. The humble M&S chicken salad sandwich will have 6 border movements north, south, east and west. And the humble cottage pie will have 8 movements north, south, east and west. And all of those movements are going to have more friction. What we need is for the UK government to put forward technical solutions. And we also need the EU to have a generosity of spirit to allow those mitigations to happen. Our overriding asks have been for representation, mitigation, derogation and compensation, which is essential if we're to safely navigate this upheaval. The other thing is that we need to see this in the context of COVID-19 and that there is little bandwidth or financial capacities amongst NI business to deal with what's happening with Brexit because of COVID. There's going to be even less in January. We're coming into what's known as the golden quarter for retail, and our storage will be filled already for the Christmas market, and will not be able to stockpile for the Brexit transition ending, which is hugely worrying for not only us but for Northern Ireland consumers. If I briefly touch on the internal market, well, prima facie, it does do a couple of good things for NI to GB. However, this whole thing of the blockade, absolute nonsense from the start, because it's the internal market bill doesn't touch GB to NI in that way and would never do anything in that way. We've also had reassurance from the EU government or for the EU Commission that they would never have done anything like that. It reminds me a lot of I don't know how many of you are fans of Yes Minister, but that episode where he made the whole thing about the EU trying to ban the British sausage just so he could come out as a winner. That's exactly what has happened here. They've made a big fuss over nothing so that they can claim a win of the EU claiming down. That didn't happen. The other side of things is that prima facie, as I said, it does do a couple of good things, NI to GB. However, what you have to remember is business like certainty and a wee touch of sanity as well. And even though this makes things a little bit easier on the face of it, you cannot build a business model on something that is actionable in court. You wouldn't do it if you were buying a house that had several different legal aspects going on or cases pending. And in the same way, you can't do that for Northern Ireland. So for us, the big message is that the eyes need to be kept on the prize. And that prize is some common sense decisions from the Joint Committee. And most of all, an FTA with the EU, zero tariff, zero quota. But as well as that, it needs to be more wide-ranging than that. You see, when everybody is looking at this and we're talking about trade, for the EU, this isn't about Brexit. This is existential for them. And they're looking at people like Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, people on their borders who, if there are special things given to Northern Ireland and given to UK who are outside the EU, then they will want those too. So we're quite myopic in our view of what Brexit means. But for me and for a lot of business people here, it's not just about the macroeconomics of trade, it's about the microeconomics of Northern Ireland households and whether or not they will be able to afford the cost rises. Quite simply, the answer is they won't be.
Sorry, schoolboy error, I muted myself. Thank you, Aodhan, that was great, but also not great. I mean, loads of huge concern there for the people of Northern Ireland that we hope will get resolved over the next few months, though I wouldn't say that we're wholeheartedly confident of that, unfortunately, at the moment. Claire, let's come to you, please, and it'd be great to hear from your perspective. Obviously, I'm sure you can bring us something of a European perspective on all of this.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks for the opportunity to be involved in this. As you introduced me earlier, I am a former Labour MEP, amongst other things. So, yeah, can look at this as from the EU perspective. But following my brief, I'll look at it from a constitutional perspective primarily, and what the situation we find ourselves in. And you can look at the sweep of the whole Brexit negotiations and see how much strain the British Constitution has been put under by all of this. And if you start from the fact that A, we don't have a written constitution, but B, we also have a situation where the executive is drawn from the legislature. So the government comes from the MPs, and there isn't that distinction between the two bodies. When America, the founding fathers who put America together constitutionally, were very clear about the need to separate those two functions. So you had accountability built into the system. Taking the government from MPs takes out that kind of accountability level, particularly when you have a majority of MPs for one party or another. And this is not a new problem for the British Constitution. Lord Hailsham in the 1970s talked about elective dictatorship within the UK. So this is a continuation of that problem. But it was mitigated by what Peter Hennessy describes as the good chap theory of government. We'll park the gender connotations of that, but the fact that there was a sort of code of honour about how you would operate British government. Got stretched sometimes, but it was there in the way you operate. It has been stretched to breaking point, in my view, over the last 4 years. You've seen that with, goodness knows, you can take any one of a number of examples about, for example, prorogation. But you are now seeing with this government, the Johnson elected government and Cummings at the helm, you're seeing this being taken to a whole new level. And I think inevitably I'm going to touch on a couple of current legislative issues, one being trade and the other one being the internal market bill, and where we are seeing the constitution being pushed to breaking point. So with trade, I can make that direct comparison with the European Parliament and what the British Parliament's role. And in fact, therefore, the representation for British citizens in terms of how they have a say over trade. So in the European Parliament, the work is conducted through committees. Now, these committees have real teeth. They have a kind of legislative role in the way that British select committees, the House of Commons select committees, don't. So the Trade Committee in the European Parliament had rights over what it could see. It had rights of scrutiny over what it would see. And loosely, you could describe the Commission as the executive, but the Commission felt a responsibility to be answerable to the Trade Committee in the European Parliament. So it took account of its views all the way through processes. And perhaps the most obvious example of that was with TTIP, the EU-US trade deal. And I remember this very well. The Inter Committee, the Trade Committee in the European Parliament, managed to ensure that there was a lot more openness built into that trade deal negotiations than was necessarily there on the statute book even. But they got rights to see documents, they got transparency into the system, and it then evolved. And it evolved to the extent that there was dissatisfaction with that trade deal that resulted in public campaigns in a number of countries, most notably the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands, but elsewhere as well, against two particular factors within that: the trade dispute mechanism ISDS and the potential threat to public services. And the ultimate consequence of that was the European Parliament voted to veto the trade deal. And the trade deal stalled. So, and actually in 2019, the council, so the national ministers in the EU, then decided they would revoke the mandate that they had given to the Commission for that particular trade deal. So you had this democratic interaction from voters to the elected politicians. As I say, the UK, this was very much part of how that happened. And that had direct consequences as a result of elected representatives. With the trade deals, the bills going through the British Parliament, trade deals going through the British Parliament, you don't have that. Select committees don't have a statutory function in that way. They don't really have a legislated role for scrutiny in the same way. So you've got that real issue of not having that constitutional accountability in the British system. And that is a flaw, it's a fundamental flaw. And it means that, and it's also sitting alongside a situation where, because we're leaving the EU, the government are saying it wants freedom to write its own legislation, but we don't have new British legislation around environmental standards or food standards, two crucial issues in trade deals. So, basically, Liz Truss can go away and sign whatever trade deal she likes and backfill the legislation on environmental or food standards, because they aren't in place and because there isn't a constitutional electoral protection for us on trade deals in that way. And there's no standard procedure, if you like, because the government is saying we're not standard, we're going to move off in our own sweet direction, but that isn't clear what direction that is yet. So, on the trade side, that's where we've got a real issue. It's also important, I think, now to touch on the internal market bill and to touch on that from two points of view, particularly, and again, from the constitutional perspective. First, and they both relate to Articles 42, 43 and 45, and most particularly Article 45 of the Internal Market Bill. And that article is the one that you will no doubt have all come across in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol and the international law point. But it says that, I'm just going to read this, regulations made by ministers on state aid or customs declarations, Articles 42 and 43, will have legal effect notwithstanding their incompatibility with any rule of international or domestic law whatsoever, unquote. So it gives government ministers carte blanche to write regulations regardless of our environmental standards, regardless of our food standards, any of that. That's what they are basically saying. Now, an agreement was reached with MPs this week that says an amendment will be that Article 45, if it's ever invoked, they're arguing it won't be invoked, or sometimes they argue it won't be invoked, would go back to the House of Commons to a vote. But then you hit that loop again. The House of Commons, the executive is drawn from the legislature, the government has a majority in the House of Commons. If a government minister decides to do it, then they have an 80-seat majority. You have to cross your fingers and hope to God you can get 40 Tory MPs to rebel in order to ensure we don't breach an international piece of legislation or a domestic piece of legislation. I do not regard the compromise that was reached with Tory MPs this week as in any way sufficient to protect us from that clause in the Internal Market Bill. So we are going to be relying on the unelected chamber, God love them, of the House of Lords, or the judiciary to somehow mitigate that article in the in the laws. And we don't, and that then becomes the way this government wants to operate, which is in a culture war space. So it means they can go to law, go to war with the House of Lords, or they can go to war again with the judiciary, and it will enjoy that fight. It will find that fight useful to themselves. So, you know, you've got really difficult space around those provisions. But finally, you've also then got the constitutional position of the devolved administrations. And what happens to the Sewell Convention? Again, you're relying on a convention and not actually a statutory process. So you've got what the Scottish or the Welsh administrations, what there is in their devolved rights, being trampled all over by a centralised government. Now, again, I can talk till the cows come home about the rights and wrongs of that, but actually, big picture, this plays into the SNP's hands. This plays into the hands of independence and breaking up the UK, because you're looking at them not getting a say over trade deals. You're looking at them not being involved in the negotiations, not having a say over trade deals, and consequently having what are devolved responsibilities walked all over by the internal market bill. And so in any which way you look at this, I would say we are in desperate trouble in terms of the constitutional implications of the way this government are handling the current Brexit negotiations. I'll leave it there because I think there's a lot sort of stuffed into those statements, but be afraid. Thanks, Mike.
That was great, and also very worrying. So you've got two highly worrying speeches so far, but I mean, sadly, I think that is that just describes the context that we're in. Hamish, we'll come to you, Chair of Labour Business. I hope to give us a perspective from the business community and from manufacturing about the trajectory that we are on.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's lovely to be with you and everybody else. As you say, I'll try and give a business perspective from Labour Business, which for those of you who don't know it, is the business membership organisation affiliated to the Labour Party, or one of the 21 socialist societies who are affiliated. So we're an affiliate, but we're independent and have a certain freedom to speak our own mind, because what I'm saying is not yet Labour Party policy. And our members give us some insight, because our members are Labour Party members up and down the country in businesses, small, medium and large, in all sectors, including, very helpfully, that was before I met Aodhan, we have a member in Northern Ireland who runs a business there, who's given us a lot of insight into the significance of the Brexit issue in Ireland. I think that I'll split this up into two things, Mike, if I may. One is to look at the attitude of our members to Brexit and to where we are today. And then I want to look forward as well at a piece of work we've done within our international trade policy group to try to work out some principles that ought to apply to any future deal, not only with the EU, but also with other countries. Now, this is based on surveys. We love surveys in Labour Business. Unlike some other affiliates, we are always surveying our members to find out what their views are before we start shooting our mouths off. And we've done a number of surveys on this subject. Now, obviously, because, as I say, our members are Labour Party members, it's not necessarily representative. But what we find also in doing roundtables and events and forums with businesses is that the views of our members are not unrepresentative of all businesses. They all want some similar things, some certainty, some access to markets, particularly those close by. So although they may have a Labour Party membership card, I think they also speak quite widely for the business community. More generally, it's just that business people you find who are not members of the party are very reluctant to come out and say anything publicly. But when we talk to them privately, the surveys that I'm going to share with you are probably representative of views that are widely held in the business community generally. So looking at our membership view of Brexit from sort of early days, we did our first survey in February of 2018, and that showed a very substantial majority in favour of Remain, 79%, and it stayed at about that level through all the subsequent surveys, high 70s, low 80s. And when you unpick that, it's all around the lack of access to the biggest market, that risk of tariffs and other non-tariff barriers being introduced, and as I said before, the lack of certainty about what the business climate will be for their goods or services that they're trying to sell. So it became very clear to us very early that the surveys generally and the expert opinion generally about the very adverse business impact of Brexit was felt by those on the front line who are actually trying to run a business in the UK. And I know that Brexit is not just about business, it's about identity politics and a whole range of other things as well. But there's no doubt in my mind from our surveys and our conversations with businesses more widely that the impact of Brexit, especially without a deal, and I'll come back to that when I look forward, is a massive and totally predictable consequence of leaving the EU. So in September of 2018, on the back of that survey, we supported the contemporary resolution at Labour Party conference for Remain and for a public vote. And I started working closely with you, Mike, on that campaign. That was a necessary thing for us to do, because that was about the only way we could see of unscrambling the referendum result, was to put it back to the people. We did a second survey in January of 2019, again, very strong pro-Remain majorities, real unhappiness with the Labour leadership's position, the lack of clarity and the lack of certainty for businesses. Another survey in June of last year, the third survey, underscoring that our members felt that Remain was still best for business, and actually they ratcheted up the political rhetoric by coming out in favour of revoking Article 50, which I never really thought was practical politics at the time, but I think it did reflect the fact that businesses were desperate to get this resolved, and the uncertainty of a further public vote was not necessarily something that businesses wanted. And what they really wanted, certainly from our membership's point of view, was just to stop the juggernaut by revoking Article 50 altogether. So in annual conference last year, when we last had an actual physical conference, supported a contemporary resolution again for a public vote. And we know what happened to that. So fast forward to this year, May 2020, our fourth survey. And this was really around what happens with the negotiations around exiting. So a clear rejection of no deal, a clear desire to extend the transition period and seek through negotiation a close alignment with the EU. And it was against the background of other questions we asked about the impact of COVID-19. And clearly that was looking like a double whammy to our members of the huge economic hit from Brexit at the end of this year, and the equally huge, if not even larger, economic hit from COVID-19. On the back of that, we approached Keir Starmer shortly after he was elected, asking him to call for an extension. And of course he didn't, and we completely understand the politics of that. He doesn't want to be tarred as a Ramona again. But where we are now, his political point, I think, for debate, we strongly feel that the Labour leadership needs to hold the government to its promises of this oven-ready deal. And while we shouldn't oppose a deal, Brexit is going to happen, we want to have the deal that was promised at the last election when the Tories won their 80-member majority. So that's kind of my quick review of where our members are and where I suspect many businesses are on Brexit. Looking forward, I think I would say this. I think that absolute priority is to avoid a no deal or a thin deal, because that will have all of the worst consequences of Brexit for the economy and for businesses. So as our members have told us, they want the closest possible alignment with the EU. And as I say, we've come up with these 10 principles. You'll find them on our website. I won't talk about all of them. I just wanted to highlight those that were most economic or business oriented in flavour. And they're a bit, to put them in context, a bit like the 6 tests that Keir Starmer applied. You remember them about the deal? But they're building on that. And as I say, I think they're relevant also to any deals that we want to negotiate, whether it's with the US or other countries. So not in order of importance, number 1 is about workers' protection, to ensure that there is the same level of protection for workers before as after, and hopefully a dynamic level of protection which keeps pace with the best standards in the world, including the EU, but also in other parts of the world. And that, you know, is also something that businesses actually want. We're too reluctant in the Labour Party, I think, to recognise that businesses actually share a lot of our values, because think of it from a competition point of view. If other employers are competing with you who don't protect their workers as you do, that's unfair competition, and businesses don't want that. They want a level playing field. So I think there's lots of support in the business community for worker protection, and that may surprise you, but that's what we found. Looking at the sector focus, obviously we have an economy today that's dominated by services rather than manufacturing. Services make up about 80% of our economy. And that's why when we talk about close alignment, we're looking not just at the things that tend to be debated in the media about customs union, about, you know, on the paradigm of I want to sell my goods, my car, my aerospace engine, whatever it is. And we've debated customs rules a lot. But actually, for the 80% of the economy made up of services, it's the single market rules, the non-tariff barriers that are really, really important. So our members want, you know, access to a digital single market, access to the services market in the EU. And just a comment about you know, what do we do if we crash out with a no deal? I live in Wales. I'm speaking here from Wales. I'm surrounded by sheep, and our sheep farmers in Wales know that if we don't get a deal and we crash out on WTO terms, that's an immediate 25% tariff on the sale of lamb to Europe, which is the biggest market for Welsh lamb, 25%. And when the government says, well, we'll have a wonderful trade deal with Japan and you can sell your lamb to Japan. Well, first of all, I'm not sure how much lamb the Japanese eat, but even if they did, I think it'd be rather easier for them to source it from New Zealand than from Wales. So there's just a total lack of reality about how trade works in agricultural products, among many others. The third principle we think is really important is consumer standards. And again, like workers' protection, workers' rights, businesses want to be competing with other businesses who also protect consumers in the same way, so that they're not disadvantaged by those who are prepared to sell shoddy goods and not give consumers any remedies. A fourth point, really, really important for the future, is access to all of the European organizations that promote science and technology and research. So that's an equally important agenda looking ahead, not just for the digital economy, but for all parts of the modern economy. Fifthly, and more difficult for Labour, I think in the past, our members take a very strong pro-immigration approach because they can't grow their businesses without two things. One is investment in technology, the other is investment in people, and that includes people from outside the UK, whether it's the EU or the rest of the world. So it's a positive immigration approach, which is absolutely crucial to successful businesses. Lastly, and I wasn't going to mention this, but because Claire touched upon it, and I agree so strongly, I wanted to mention that one of our 10 principles is around transparency. Because as Claire rightly says, this business of negotiating trade deals with no scrutiny as the deal develops is absolutely unconscionable. And I've been told by one of our vice presidents, Bill Esterson, MP, you may know him, and he's on the shadow trade team, he's been involved in some of these discussions, and he's found out more about the draft proposals from the UK in the US trade negotiation from US trade unions who have a right of access to those drafts, which we do not. And that to me is just a sort of Alice in Wonderland, crazy, crazy world in which that is possible. So I think of the 10, in some ways, I would suggest transparency is the most important principle that we've got to fight for as we do a deal with the EU and with other countries. So thank you, Mike. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, Hamish, as always. And David Lawrence, last but very much not least. David works for the trade justice movement, and I'm sure you can guess what they do by the title. So, and David's a policy advisor. So, David, tell us what you want to tell us. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Great to be involved with this. That's right, I work for the trade justice movement. We represent charities and trade unions who have an interest in trade policy. And kind of just to follow on from what Hamish was just saying, we represent very much the non-business side of things. But we've been really surprised over the last few years at how often we've been saying the exact same thing as large corporations who previously we might have seen as the enemy, you know, big corporations close to government, capitalism, private sector and so on. But we've been asking for the exact same things. And I've been in meetings with the CBI and the International Chambers of Commerce, and they've been coming to us and saying, do you know what the government's plans are? Because, you know, this is really worrying. And we've kind of been like, well, you know, we don't know. So we thought you guys would know as businesses, but they've been left out of the room as well. And we've been wanting the exact same things on scrutiny, on standards, on transparency, just to know what the hell is going on and what the government's plans are. But also in terms of maintaining continuity after Brexit, we've been on the exact same page ever since referendum, which has been a really weird thing for us and for the TUC and for a number of trade unions, that the enemy isn't business at all. Everyone is demanding clarity from the government and wanting some sort of certainty as we step out into the unknown with Brexit. But I wanted to just talk about what I'm going to call 5 ironies that I think have come to the fore in the last month or so. And I think for those of us working in trade policy, Brexit has been a series of irony after irony. And I'll explain a bit more about what I mean by that. I think particularly in the light of the internal market bill this week. I think these are 5 ironies which tell us a bit about how well this government is doing, how well they're handling Brexit, and were these ironies not so depressing, they would also be an amusing indictment of where we're at the moment. So irony number 1, in breaking international law, global Britain has lost respect on the global stage. The government has just, in full view of the world, reneged on its first international treaty since leaving the EU. And yet we're supposedly about to sign trade agreements with countries all over the world. Britain was once respected for its commitment to rule of law. And we're publicly sending a message to the world that we don't care about rule of law at all. Margaret Thatcher once said, Britain does not break treaties. It would be bad for Britain, bad for relations with the rest of the world, and bad for any future treaty on trade. And as much as I don't want to publicly agree with Margaret Thatcher, she is absolutely right on this. It's really simple. We can't be global Britain if we break international law, and we lose all authority on anything else that we want to show leadership on the global stage, whether it's holding China to account for their own disregard for international treaties in Hong Kong or in Xinjiang, or whether it's signing all the trade agreements. We can't sign trade agreements. We can't form defense pacts. We can't meaningfully have allies at a time when international cooperation is more important than ever before. We can't do any of that if we're not respected, if we're not trusted to keep our treaties. So irony number 1 is that global Britain has lost respect on the global stage. Irony number 2, and I think this is something that's become evident over the last month or so, is that Britain's new trading partners want us to have a deal with the EU. That's what they want. They're not saying, oh, finally Britain's left, we can do trade deals with them. Their number 1 concern has been making sure Britain still has continued access to the European market, because that's why countries trade with Britain. The government's heralding the Japan deal as a huge success, but Japan only wanted to get a deal done so quickly because they're terrified of a no-deal Brexit, meaning that they don't have the deal they already had with the UK through EU membership. So it's not a Brexit victory in the slightest. It's because of the danger of Brexit that deal's been agreed so quickly. And it's largely almost exactly the same as the deal we already had as EU members. And Canada and Australia and other countries have also emphasized the absolute priority of continued trade with the EU after Brexit. So Japan knows this, Canada knows this, that's why they want a deal with Britain. Britain's non-EU trade partners want us to have a deal with the EU, and it's a complete lie that Brexit is a new opportunity for new trade deals, because that's not what our trading partners want. Irony number 3, the one trading partner that the government thought that they could rely on after Brexit is the US. But after this month's shenanigans, even the US is giving us the cold shoulder. And as many of you will have seen, US congressmen, not just Democrats, also a number of Republicans, but also particularly Joe Biden, feel a huge sense of duty towards the Republic of Ireland. They see it as incumbent on them to uphold the Good Friday Agreement to make sure it applies. And they've said that there's no chance of a UK-US trade agreement if the Good Friday Agreement is under threat. So the irony here is that the supposed prize of Brexit, a trade deal with the US, is being scuppered by Johnson's own Brexit plans for Northern Ireland. So again, in a bid to put forward his form of Brexit, he's losing what he's described as the prize of it. And I also just want, if we just take a step back to realize how ridiculous this is, we are more willing to listen to and adjust our policy towards Northern Ireland in the light of what the US says than in the light of what Irish people themselves say, or indeed the EU themselves are calling for. The government's so desperate to ignore our European neighbours that we're taking more seriously. We'd rather take orders from Washington. And if anything does save the Good Friday Agreement, it may well just be a Joe Biden presidency which demands that we protect the Good Friday Agreement in order to get a trade deal, not to even mention all the dangers within a US trade deal, which I could go on about, but won't. Which leads us to irony 4, and Claire sort of touched on this already. If a deal is rejected by Congress, it will be because their elected representatives have more of a say over trade agreements than ours do. And it's one of the great ironies of Brexit in that in taking back control, we've reduced the power that our elected representatives have over our trade and international policy, and therefore the power and representation that our ordinary citizens have over our standing in the world, our trade policy, our international treaties, than we had in the EU through our MEPs. The European Parliament, as Claire has outlined, has much better processes for treaty scrutiny. Japan has better processes for treaty scrutiny, so does the US. Our trade deals get to be reviewed and seen by these other countries. Our own representatives don't get to review and see them, which I think is, irony number 4, one of the big ironies of Brexit. And lastly, irony number 5, and I think this is a slightly more subtle one, but it's of some interest to those of us on the left. One of the reasons Johnson wants to change the withdrawal agreement is the EU's restrictions on state aid, which either he didn't realise during the withdrawal agreement, or they did realise and they always plan to do this. But that's one thing that's been cited, which would make it harder for the government to subsidise firms which operate in Northern Ireland. And now the irony here, and Claire will correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, the Conservatives have spent decades campaigning for stronger state aid rules at the European level on the basis of their free market ideology. And if there's one thing which the left has criticised the EU for, it's been the state aid restrictions and the desire to be able to use state subsidy to support companies. So of all the things for the government to quibble with the EU over, this is surely one of the oddest. And I don't know exactly what the reasoning behind it is. I know some pundits on the left have said, I think rather optimistically in my opinion, that the government has some grand ambition for state aid and subsidy and subsidising companies. I think we're yet to see the detail on that, and I'm not convinced that that's what the government wants to do. I think this is more likely to be much more about Brussels control and not wanting the EU and the ECJ to have a say in things after Brexit. But I think it's deeply ironic that of all the things, it would be state aid that would be the issue for this Conservative Party, which is, given that this is an issue where the Conservatives were traditionally one of the few issues where they were aligned to the EU. So that's irony number 5. So those are just some initial thoughts about the Internal Market Bill and where we're at with Brexit. And happy to continue the discussion further over the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all the speakers. Right, we've got some questions appearing in the chat. If you have a question, please post it in the chat and we'll get through them as quick as we can. So first one we've got is from David. Has Labour as a party prepared a comprehensive list of laws that it will put forward in order to maintain the best standards and practices that we had under Europe? Claire, do you want to take that? I think I know the answer, but give us your view. You're on mute.
Sorry, Mike, there we go. My rookie error, had mute on. Can you just read that question again? Sorry.
Yes. Has Labour as a party prepared a comprehensive list of laws that it will put forwards in order to maintain the best standards and practices that we had under Europe? So have we, essentially, has the Labour Party got a set of demands or things that it will put into legislation once we get back into government that would restore standards to where they are now, or have we, as Labour, not thought that far ahead as yet?
I hesitate to speak for the front bench on this, as I'm not on the front bench, but I think you can tell from all the statements that have been made that we see the point of continuing to be aligned on environmental standards, on food standards, and for all sorts of reasons. The reasons being that, as David has just talked about, this is about our domestic economy, but it's also about our international economy. And why wouldn't you maintain high standards, or indeed build on them? They're not. They can be a floor. They don't have to be. They're not a ceiling. So but looking at having those standards going forward, I would be astonished if the Labour Party in 4 years' time, because tragically we are likely to have to wait that long, wouldn't look at reinstating those standards. And God knows how much damage we're going to have to repair, but looking at getting back to a European level of protection for all of our areas. But as I say, we need to understand the situation we're in now, which is not even where we were a year ago with a hung parliament. We are now in an 80-seat majority. And although that majority looks flaky on various things like China or other areas, it is absolutely not flaky if you came to deregulation. You would see 80 Tory, all the Tory MPs walking through a lobby on reducing employment law or environmental standards.
Great. Thank you, Claire. Question for Aodhan. I think you've already answered it in the chat, but I think that's not been seen by everybody. So I'll ask it verbally as well. What specifically would you like the Labour Party to do that we should or could do to support Northern Ireland retailers, or indeed support trade more generally between Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Well, I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there. For example, in the internal market bill, and people making it about blockade Northern Ireland and what it does GBT-NI, when actually it does absolutely nothing. GB2NI, that's something that will probably get covered in the finance bill. But what we really need is we came out whenever the command paper in Northern Ireland was put together about a week or so later, and we put out a paper with 67 questions that we needed as Northern Ireland business to continue to operate. And we've only had about 5 or 6 of those questions answered. So I think both in the Commons and in the Lords and in general, it is to continue to ask those questions to get factual answers. And I know some people, it's really hard to resist the urge to beat the head of the government about this in point score. What we really need, though, is those answers, and to continue to do that. The other thing is that this myth that Northern Ireland is sorted anyway, because sure, there's a protocol, and the Prime Minister said, give us a ring or put the pieces of paper in the bin. There not be paperwork. We need that broken down. We need people to understand that we've never had these frictions before, and that frictions mean cost, and that cost will be borne by the most economically vulnerable in our society. I'm doing a piece of work at the moment with the Consumer Council to try and look at what that actually means. For every couple of percent that their basket of groceries go up, how many what percent of Northern Ireland public will go into food poverty, and this is the crux for me, and I'll go back to what I said at the start, this isn't about macroeconomics and trade. You know, those things will happen in time. You got to remember, trade deals usually take 4 years, 8 months to do. A lot of households in Northern Ireland don't have the financial stability of 4 months to take cost increases. That's will continue to be my priority on this.
Great, thank you. Right, we've got a question from Paul. Does the government not recognise that the internal market bill is stoking calls for Scottish independence, or are they just too arrogant to care? Claire, I know you mentioned this in your talk. I'll come back to you on this one.
Yeah, they're arrogant, for sure they're arrogant, and for sure they think that they can deal with a question at a time, so to speak, that, yeah, that's a problem for tomorrow, not a problem for today. So they appear not to be at all strategic in any of their behaviours right now. It is all about tactics and campaigning mode as well. So, yeah, they're not in governing mode, they're in campaigning mode. And as I mentioned in my comments earlier on, I think this is a very real consequence that could come about, because exemplified, it's not only because of the internal market bill, but the internal market bill exemplifies the centralising, we know best, we are going to tell everyone else what they should do behaviours of this government. It applies equally to local government, it applies equally to, well, obviously the situation with Northern Ireland. And indeed this perspective, you know, on the behaviour with regards to international treaties and ripping up international treaties. All of this is a level of arrogance and a lack of perspective that is already now, it has done so much damage, never mind what's going to happen. It has broken relationships. The EU are head in hands about the UK and where we're going from now. And it is absolutely, as I mentioned earlier, playing into the SNP's hands. This is, you know, Boris Johnson was always, you know, already the ideal villain for Nicola Sturgeon. You couldn't do a kind of identikit person to go, this is why we want to be separated from Westminster. But, you know, they don't have to live up to that reputation, and yet at every turn they are doing so. So yes, the breakup of the union is now, in my view, a frighteningly